Hi everyone. I learned a very important lesson this last weekend. And the lesson was don't make 5 videos in 2 days because the fifth one is bound to have some mistakes in it. Now, while I do agree with how I answered every other point in the video I made in response to Scott's treatise on morality, the part I brought up about Euthyphro's dilemma requires a clearer answer than I presented. To be clear, I still believe that in order for good to exist, it has to come outside of a finite, imperfect being, but the question still ought to be asked if we are trying to understand the very nature of good. Now, it's amazing to me how many topics come into play for the Christian when we think about Euthyphro's dilemma. So I'm quite frankly overjoyed that I have so much more to say now, and this response will be to Scott in a few places, but is also for everyone else who wants to know the truth about Euthyphro's dilemma. So let's unpack this heavy load of a question. Here it is for those of you watching who may not know what dilemma it presents. It essentially asks, is good good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? Now, while the questions themselves aren't wrong to ask, the underlying assumptions behind those questions are where the real flaws in this argument are. It reminds me of a quote by someone named Ezra Pound. She says this: "The technique of infamy is to invent two lies and then get people arguing heatedly over which one of them is true. In this case, the lies aren't in the questions, but they are in the ideas behind them," like I said. The first question assumes that if good is good only because God commands it, then it's arbitrary because God puts no sensible reason behind what is good. The second question assumes that if good is something God recognizes, then it must be something outside of himself. What I'm going to prove here is that Euthyphro's dilemma is nothing more than a smokescreen thrown up to cloud God's character. Once the smoke is cleared away, God is readily visible again, and we find that the dilemma itself is hypocritical in its usage. Now, in reference to the arbitrary argument for God's commands of good and what makes good, his goodness is in many ways similar to what you, Scott, say about morality, that what we see as good is what brings happiness and well-being in many, many cases. God's view of good does bring that true happiness, and like the Bible says, is for our own good. Deuteronomy 10:13 says that. They are not just arbitrarily decided. God recognizes that it would be best for us to live a happy life. This is why he put boundaries on sexual behavior and on how we treat each other and even on how we treat ourselves. The difference between living a happy, flourishing life in Christianity and atheism is that life has value in the former and none in the latter. Now, I get a lot of pushback from atheists when I say that in their worldview life has no value, but it's not an invalid argument. In atheism, why do I say that life has no value? Because we as human beings, and listen very carefully to this, because we as human beings do not all collectively agree that all human life has value. An example in the past of this horrible line of thinking spawns from possibly the most famous murderer of all time, Adolf Hitler. He held the belief that Jews were less than human and that Aryans were the pure race. That was less than 100 years ago, and it truly showed the destruction of believing that not all life, all human life, has value. And some may respond to me and say, well, that was a long time ago. We don't all think that way anymore. We think completely differently now. Do we really? I want to give a number of examples where even today we do not all respect human life, not all human life. And the first example is in abortion itself. And I know in just saying that, some of my viewers are going to roll their eyes, but it's an easily defensible position. And I want to present it this way. Why do we as a society think it's worse to kill a woman who is pregnant than to kill a woman alone? Now, we have this law called the Unborn Victims of Violence Act of 2004 in the United States, which is a law that recognizes, as the law says here, that a child in utero is a legal victim if he or she is injured or killed during the commission of any of over 60 listed federal crimes of violence. The law defines child in utero as a member of the species of Homo sapiens at any stage of development who was carried in the womb. So our own society gives that as a law. And we also have the Roe versus Wade um, law as well, that a woman has a right to an abortion. But I see that as a contradiction because I think the initial instinct, like if you just think about, I don't know if any of you have been in this situation yourselves, but think about a pregnant woman about to fall. The reaction is to reach out, I think, more than you would for just a woman who wasn't pregnant. And the reason being is that we see that life inside of her as valuable and as precious. Now, my sister and her husband just had their second child, a baby girl. They have two baby girls. When they had their first, they bought a picture frame that has the caption underneath, "Before you were born, we loved you." They loved the life inside. They loved the baby that they were about to see, not the fetus that has no value. But that's the argument that we make. When we make the argument that abortion is valid, we're saying that not all life, all human life, has intrinsic value. And when we make that argument, we forfeit our right to say that life has value because we say it does, because we do not all collectively agree on that. Now, I have a cinematic example of this from the movie Seven, for those of you who've seen it, the movie with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, where at the end, where Kevin Spacey tells Brad Pitt that he killed his wife, Brad Pitt is crushed and broken. But then he says, in a very sick way, that she begged for her life and she begged for the life of the baby inside her. And it was that sent Brad Pitt over the edge to kill him because of that. Because that life had value to Brad Pitt. It had value to the character he was playing in the movie, and it had value to his wife. Life does have value, but it's not because we decide it or don't decide it. And another example of this, not just going on from abortion. I want to read this article that I found online. It says, writing in the Journal of Medical Ethics, Dr. Minerva, a University of Milan bioethicist, argued that after-birth abortion should be permissible in all cases in which abortion is. They state that like an unborn child, a newborn has yet to develop hopes, goals, and dreams, and so, while clearly human, is not a person, someone with a moral right to life. In contrast, parents, siblings, and society have aims and plans that could be affected by the arrival of that child, and their interests should come first. How selfish is that? The article, After-Birth Abortion, Why Should the Baby Live?, first addresses scenarios in which parents are unaware their child is disabled until after it's born. There are a number of people I know who have children with disabilities. It doesn't mean their lives don't have value and they can live very happy lives. But again, this is the kind of argument that we get from human beings when we think that we are the ones that determine whether or not life has value. And it's frankly ridiculous. Another example is doctor-assisted suicide for depression. I have an article from the British Medical Journal in October of 2008. It says, the researchers found in the study they were doing that the current practice of legalized assistance with dying allowed some potentially clinically depressed patients to receive a lethal prescription. 15 of the participants met the criteria for depression and 13 for anxiety. 42 patients had died by the end of the study, 18 received a prescription for a lethal medication under the Act, and 9 died by lethal ingestion. Now, this is basically saying that depression, getting depressed or getting down, is a legitimate reason to end a life. Now, when we honestly present that as truth, we're presenting a situation where if we just go through a rough patch of life, we ought to have the option to end our lives. What does that say about how we truly value life? We do not all agree that all human life has value. In God, we all have the same value. We all were given the gift of life, and no one has more of a right to life than another. God offers a value to life that an atheistic belief cannot hope to match. If you believe humans decide the right to life, be prepared for a day where simply by the personal whim of a majority of human beings, you are treated as less than valuable because of how you think or look. The Bible offers us the truth that we are all one in Christ, regardless of our skin color or our mental capacity. He loves each of us the same. Humanity cannot and never will be able to offer that same courtesy. Now, going back to the fact that God does in fact give us laws for our own good, I have to read this quote that Ravi Zacharias presented. He said, "Before you remove a fence, you have to ask yourself why it was put there in the first place." Now, I want to give some examples of us removing fences and boundaries that God has put in place. For example, in the interest of pursuing our own sexual desires simply because we have them, we have removed the fence of sexual boundaries, and in its removal, it's devastated our culture. We now live in a society where many fathers wanted the pleasure of having sex at a young age but had no desire to stick around once that kid was born. This has led to broken homes and children growing up without a father figure. It has led to the sexual relationship in a marriage or other romantic relationship being destroyed by pornography, where the fantasy aspect of looking at pornography wants to come into reality, and that perfect idea, quote unquote, of what sex should be will leave a man feeling unsatisfied if the marriage partner or partner in a relationship doesn't look like or do the things that a porn actress would. It has ended many relationships. It leaves many women feeling undesired by their men, that their men have to pursue other women to truly have a sexual high. It's disrespectful and again selfish. God put boundaries on how we treat each other for the same purpose. True happiness doesn't come from whatever we individually decide makes us happy. Some people can find themselves happiness or joy by causing others pain. Now, Scott, you mentioned the golden rule that we ought to treat each other with respect in the same way that we would want to be treated. This idea is also given by God in the book of Luke when he says, "Do unto others as you would have done unto you." Others have repeated this same essential idea in other faiths. So why is there this universal idea that we ought to treat others with respect? Almost universal, I should say. I feel that you, Scott, would say because we all have the same idea and that is what makes the idea golden. But if it's simply what most of us may agree on that makes for what is golden or right, you can literally justify any human action simply because enough people agree with that belief. The reason this golden rule seems all but universal is actually found in the book of Romans, where the Apostle Paul reminds us that God has written his law on our hearts so that we are without excuse. Don't let the fact that this is on your heart and on your conscience make you think that this idea comes from you. God created you with this law on your heart, and that is why there are some universally understood truths, not just because enough of us agree with them. Now that isn't the only reason that God's idea of good isn't arbitrary, as though he makes moral commands just for the sake of making a command. His moral commands are also to accomplish his perfect, wise goal for us. If he created us with the intent to have us bring glory to him through our respect of him, a common biblical theme, he wouldn't make a standard that said murder was good, because if he did, we wouldn't be bringing glory to him in our non-existence. He wouldn't say lying was moral like you said, Scott, said that he could have, because in itself it's a contradictory statement. It's essentially saying the truth about lying is that it's moral. We all would see past that, and it's obviously a contradictory statement, and we couldn't trust anything God said if lying really was moral. It's asserting that that statement isn't a lie. It's asserting that it's truth. Now, if it's true that we are to follow God, lying obviously cannot be part of his nature, because it's the opposite of truth and trust. Now, that's the assumption behind the first question, and that I think we can see it's entirely false when we look at God's character and His design for human life. The second question which asked, does God command something because it's good, also carries a false assumption behind the question. To assume that if God recognizes a standard of good, that it must be beyond Him is missing a very key possibility, that He recognizes that standard within Himself. Now, Scott, you've already responded to this, claiming that this would be a tautology. Now, let me define a tautology. Britannica defines it as the following. Tautology, in logic, is a statement so framed that it cannot be denied without inconsistency. Thus, all men are rational, for example, is held to assert with regard to anything whatsoever that either it is a man or it is not rational, but this universal truth, quote unquote, follows not from any facts noted about real men, but only from the actual use, or one such use, of man and rational, and is thus purely a matter of definition. The statement cannot be true, because it asserts every possible state of affairs. It is true whichsoever of it constitutes constituents, it is true whichsoever of its constituents are true, and it is also true whichsoever are false. Now let me prove why good coming from God is not a tautology. It doesn't come from Him just because He is good. He is good because He is also the God of all wisdom, who is able to discern good from bad, and He's the God of all wisdom because He is the God of all knowledge. Now a tautology, as described above, is offered if it doesn't follow from any facts. The fact that God has all knowledge is something that we can know outside of that statement. It is something that we can give examples of. Now let me give you some examples of that. We can see the immensity of God's knowledge, the infinite nature of God's knowledge in creation. We can see the mind behind the universe that created the sun and put it in a position that is the perfect distance away from the earth to give us heat, but allow for us not to burn to death, while also giving plants the ability to go through the process of photosynthesis. Now, for those who may argue that the universe isn't designed or that human life isn't designed, I want to offer an explanation for why it's so. And it's an explanation that I use a lot. And it's simply this. I work at UPS. We work in a building with an intricate lighting system, belt system, plumbing, ladders, trailer doors, everything you think ought to be in a freight building. Now, even if someone walked by this building and didn't see the designer or designers of it, they would still assume that it was created by an intelligent being simply because of the complexity of it. Now, that building is far less complex than the human body. We as humans can heal ourselves. We can reproduce life. We can reason and make videos about Euthyphro's dilemma. We can do so much more than that building. So how do we assume that there is no way the building could come together on its own, yet not believe that an incredibly more complex entity wasn't also created by intelligence? We even contradict that idea in the very fact that we ourselves create things every single day with our intelligence, not by some ridiculous theory that a creation came together by chance. Now, even if people hold entirely to the evolution argument, this example I've given still holds true. All evolution would provide is saying that they think the building came about. It wouldn't disprove a designer of the building. And when I say came about, I'm talking about natural selection, which is defined as the process by which, in the example of natural selection, how human beings came to be. It's like saying an example in reference to the building argument that, well, you see, this belt system was put here and this lighting system was put here, and it all came together to eventually create the building, and in that assume, therefore, that no one designed it. Because I've described the process by which this building came together, I have shown no one created it. That doesn't work at all. Now, another way that we can see God's intelligence as being as proving that He's all-knowing or beyond anything that we can possibly know is in the formation of the Bible. And we can see this through the prophecies that have been given that have come true in human history, showing that God gave these prophecies to people we have examples of hundreds of years before they actually came to be, and then they eventually actually come to fruition. So prophecies are one example that we can truly know that God has an infinite knowledge. The other is in just the way that the biblical narrative was written, in showing its immense complexity. Now, for examples of this, and for the sake of the length of this video, I want to point people to, first of all, search Why the Bible, Ravi Zacharias on YouTube, and watch that first video that really shows the incredible way in which the Bible was written, that proves that shows a supernatural element to it. And also to go to 100prophecies.org for a number of prophecies that have come true in human history that we can verify in our study of history that demonstrates God's supernatural nature. God's knowledge can be proven. His wisdom is possible because of his infinite knowledge, and his good is possible because of his infinite wisdom. Now that answers the dilemma for the Christian, but now I have to turn it back on the one raising the question. Because if this dilemma actually held water, and if it was the way that we decide if a being was the source of good or not, we have to turn it back on ourselves, or we are being entirely intellectually dishonest. So, if morals and goodness stem from us, is what is morally good good because we say it is, or do we say it is because it's morally good? The first would make morality arbitrary if it makes God's morality arbitrary as well, because we are just saying it's so for no reason. Now, some may argue that there is reason because we want humanity to flourish and be happy, but that means nothing unless there is value to all human life, which, as I've shown earlier, we do not all agree on. Not all human life has the same value to all human beings. Now, the second part of the dilemma could actually be true. It's entirely possible that we command what is good because we recognize it as such, which shows that morality is not something that comes from us. And it's entirely possible that it doesn't, because no constant absolute truth, like good, can come from a finite, imperfect being. And if we argue that it is good because it's in our nature, then for us it is a tautology, because we are not the source of all wisdom, and we are not the source of all knowledge, and there is no example to give that we are the source of all knowledge, like there is with the God of the Bible. Euthyphro's dilemma is a hypocritical, at best, dilemma, and it doesn't present any truth about the nature of good or of the nature of God. That's how I would explain Euthyphro's dilemma. And Scott, I hope that after you watch this, we can set up a time where we can talk at greater length about it. And I didn't quite make it to your 30-some minutes on the Treatise of Morality. I made it to 23. But I really believe that answers all the assumptions behind Euthyphro's dilemma and turns it back on the people presenting it, because, like I said, if it is the standard by which we measure whether or not someone is the source of good or an entity is the source of good, then we certainly are not the source of it. So, thank you for watching.